But in terms of immigration, a lot of people keep saying, you know, well, and you have a lot of conservative websites like WorldNet Daily who's got this, you know, they're let me put it this way, the globalists have hyped the anti-Muslim agenda, not because Muslims aren't a problem, they are a problem. But they're not a threat to the world. They're not a threat to the United States. The Muslims, except for Iran, don't have any weapon systems of their own. You can't conquer the world when you don't make any of your own weapons. It's just like Iran. They got F-14s from the United States during the Shah. And once the Ayatollah came in and the U.S. said, cut the parts supply, those F-14s weren't flying a month later. And Iran learned its lesson. That's why the globalists are trying to take down Iran. You know, they give North Korea a free ride. No sanctions on North Korea. Nothing's happening. No military option on the table. No regime change required. It's the most tyrannical regime in all the world. So it's a living prison camp. Iran, a fairly civilized nation, we've got on the chopping block constantly since 2006. 3 aircraft carrier groups off of Iran threatening them with destruction. Why? Because Iran's the only Muslim country that's threatening to develop all of their own indigenous weapon systems. Missiles, rockets, tanks, airplanes, drones. They've got all that stuff in production. That's why the sanctions. That's why you've got to cut off Iran. And so why Syria? Why is Syria under the target? Because Israel was assigned as early as 2004 to take out Iran, or at least to start the war with Iran. The theory was, you target Iran's nuclear program, they will retaliate against Israel and against all the American troops in there. That will give us, the United States, an excuse to blast Iran to smithereens. We don't intend to occupy Iran, just destroy all of their military and civilian infrastructure, bring them to the dark ages, and then they'll be out of the picture. And that's what the U.S. was planning. But Israel says, look, we've got Syria right on our border, and Syria has thousands of Scud missiles with chemical weapons. They send a volley over towards Tel Aviv, and our Iron Dome can't possibly shoot down that many missiles. So you take Syria out, or we won't attack Iran. And so 3 years ago, the United States was ready to take out Syria. Remember that no-fly zone? It wasn't a no-fly zone. It's like Libya's no-fly zone. Got cruise missiles coming in all the time. That's not a no-fly zone. That's an excuse, a cover for an illicit attack operation. We had special forces in there. We had Tomahawks. We had all kinds of... in fact, we blasted the city of Sirte with 20,000 inhabitants, killed almost everyone. And we're talking about Russian casualties in Syria. Come on, you know, we are the greatest hypocrite in the world in terms of civilian casualty. We did all that in Libya. And what's Libya today? It's a basket case full of armed jihadists, total civil war, and we created it. We're responsible for that, all in the name of what? Democracy? And so we had this 3 years ago, this no-fly zone set up, and of course the media knew exactly what the U.S. was up to. And so John Kerry steps before the London press conference and starts talking about how Assad's got to step down and we're going to, you know, take him out. And a reporter says, you know, it's very obvious to us that you're going to do an invasion and, you know, with air power in Syria. Is there anything that Assad can do to stop this? Is there anything that he can do? And Kerry just off the top of his head, oh yeah, they could give up their chemical weapons and we wouldn't attack. And the next day, Syria says, we accept. And Kerry got the biggest tongue lashing of his life when he stepped off that stage. You fool, you just ruined our agenda. You gave them an out. So the U.S. spent the next 3 months trying to prove that Assad was cheating on the weapons, on the chemical weapons disarmament. UN comes in and says, nope, they're not cheating. All false accusations. And so the U.S. was stuck. No, we're not stuck. Globalists don't take no for an answer. So what they did is they went in, you know, they were using Libyan arms and jihadists and shipping everyone in from all parts of the world where they had created unrest against the United States and started to build them up and arm them in Syria as Syrian rebels. It's not a civil war in Syria, by the way. This is an outside foreign intervention. Almost 80% of the soldiers in all of the rebel groups, including ISIS, are foreigners. Now, this is not a civil war. And Assad is not a bad guy. His father was. Hafez Assad was a bad guy. He was working with the Soviets. He was working with the CIA. He had torture chambers and rooms and other things. But his son he sent off to Europe to become a mild-mannered medical doctor. And he is just that. He's not a tyrant. He's trying to do his best to hold the country together. He has inherited a system that does have some corruption in it. But generally speaking, he's trying to do what is right. But he has to go because the Israelis demanded that Syria be defanged before they will attack Iran. By the way, that's the whole reason for the nuclear agreement. That came about at the same time as the chemical weapons. All of a sudden, the U.S. goes to Iran and says, hey, let's make a deal. And Iran says, what? After trying to attack us for the last week, you want to offer us a deal? Yeah, let's have a nuclear deal, and you won't have to give up any of your centrifuges. You won't have to give up any of your enriched uranium. Let's just make a deal that in the future you won't do any more. And Iran says, and you lift the sanctions? Oh yeah, we'll lift all the sanctions. So they start the negotiations. And then the U.S., after the first round, announces to the press, Iran has agreed to give up 50% of their centrifuges and 30% of their enriched uranium and don't do this. And the Iranians said, wait a minute, we didn't agree to any of that. And the U.S. said, oh yes, you did. And the Iranians said, we have the recordings. They were tape recording all these negotiations. And the Iranians were right. The U.S. just simply upped the ante, invented out a full, and pushed the Iranians, after inducing them into the process, then raised the bar. And they did that a second time in the second stage of the negotiation. And they did it a third time. They even added conventional disarmament to the nuclear agreement. How many missiles they could have, how many tests of this and that they could have, how many tanks they could have. What's that got to do with the nuclear agreement? You see, the U.S. was pushing them because they knew Iran was desperate to have the sanctions removed. And so they kept pushing them and say, how much will they take? And the Iranians kept taking and taking. And finally, they had this deal finalized, right? Wrong. The Iranians didn't sign. When the Congress held hearings about the Iranian nuclear deal, the administration gave them the documents, and there are no signatures on them. Iran didn't sign. And so the head of the committee goes to the State Department and says, why are there no signatures? Iran didn't sign. And why are your signatures on it? We didn't sign either because Iran didn't sign. Well, so what are we holding hearings for? This isn't in vogue. And the U.S. says, oh, yes, it is. It's a gentleman's agreement. Now, this is a big, fat trap, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, the U.S. entered into this negotiation with Iran specifically to have an excuse to stand down their aircraft carriers, because remember, they couldn't attack now because Israel's demanding you get rid of Syria first, and that was on hold because of the chemical weapons agreement. So you've got to put Iran on hold, and that's what they did. You have a nuclear agreement, but it's a trap. There are so many details in there that Iran must violate and will violate, and the U.S. knows it will violate. And they have an automatic attack clause in the agreement. It becomes part of a UN resolution that says if Iran violates any of this, there's an automatic agreement that the UN will allow the U.S. to attack. So you see, it's a big fat trap. It's not about peace at all. I mean, this is how deceptive all of this is. Did you read about any of this in the news? Well, you may have read about the fact that there was no signatures on it. That did make some of the mainstream news, but this is a massive deception. It shows just how evil this government is that we're dealing with. And so that was the nuclear agreement. But because of the chemical weapons agreement, the U.S. was stuck in the water. But as I said, globalists don't take no for an answer. So what did they do? They went through their Israeli agents. The Israeli Mossad runs hundreds of Israeli Arabs as spies and leaders within the Arab movement. They infiltrate everything. The Israelis can't do it. Believe it or not, I was over in Israel and I said, and my guide was telling me, well, he's a Jew and he's an Arab and he's in this type of area. And I said, how can you tell? They all look the same to me. Oh, we can tell. And believe me, they can tell. They can tell every nuance of facial feature and coloration of the skin of what kind of Arab and what kind of Jew. So the Jews themselves can't go in and infiltrate Jordan and Iraq and others, but their Israeli Arabs can and have done that. It's my opinion that the Israelis, in combination with the CIA and British intelligence, have infiltrated almost all of the terror groups. They did it during Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a CIA operation at the very top. That doesn't mean that the terrorists in Al-Qaeda knew that. But the leadership, Osama bin Laden, was a CIA asset. That's why he showed up in the American hospital in Dubai just before 9/11 and met with the CIA station chief. He was an agent working for the CIA. He did not do 9/11. 9/11 was a U.S. government operation from beginning to end. Now, and so was Al-Qaeda. But you know, once you start doing a phony war on terror, everybody and their dog wants to become part of the big terror organization. So the U.S. was really getting fed up with everybody claiming to be Al-Qaeda. And nobody was, no matter what the U.S. did in the war on terror, Al-Qaeda just kept growing and growing, and so the American people got apathetic about winning the war on terror. Well, we'll fix this, says the globalists. We'll give them a new terror that they won't forget. They basically went in with their Israeli agents into Syria and said, all right, half of you guys, the worst of you, you're going to be called ISIS. And we know this happened because they're still doing it today. They just created the SRA, which is the Syrian, or SDA, the Syrian Democratic Army. Out of nowhere. How did that start? They just said, you're now the SDA. You're the Free Syrian Army and the FRA and all these types of names. They just simply designate, and their leaders, of course, tell the people what to do these things. But you don't start a new terrorist organization with 50 to 60,000 people, combat terrorists, in a 3-week period. It's just impossible. But it is possible to just say, you guys are already here and you now are ISIS, and then start to direct them. And that's why every one of the beheading videos was meant and staged for one purpose only, to make a monster of ISIS. You know, if you're going to start a caliphate and take over the whole world as part of benevolent Muslim or Islam philosophy, why would you try to antagonize Muslims, Christians? I mean, they've gone after everybody in these videos. There's only one purpose of those videos, and that's to antagonize the whole world against them. What good is that? What's the purpose of that? Why antagonize the whole world against you? I mean, what does that do? It only does one thing. It promotes terror. A threat of terror, so that the U.S. can go up and say, oh, now we've got another real terror. And you notice you never hear about Al-Qaeda anymore. What happened to Al-Qaeda? Everybody was Al-Qaeda, now everybody's ISIS. Doesn't that ring any bells to you? Something's wrong with this picture. Look at the beheadings. You take these foreigners that were captured, and they sit there before the camera, and they give this heartfelt story about how ISIS is wonderful and it's doing this and that. I mean, where does this come from? And they say during the confession, we know that we're going to be killed, but you know, ISIS really is trying to do what's best, etc., etc. And then the knife goes to their throat. There's no flinching. Just as calm as a summer morning, and then the camera's cut. What does that tell you? Would you flinch if you knew you were going to be killed and a knife went? You'd be going like this, wouldn't you? Why would you even give the confession if you knew you were going to be killed? If you're going to be killed, why give the confession? I'm not going to cooperate. You see, nobody asked any questions in the media about these anomalies. And then the orange jumpsuits. They must have had a container load of orange jumpsuits. Everybody's in orange jumpsuits. And then look at the Christians, remember, being led by the sea with these giant ISIS guys, and these Christians are all about, come up to here and all in orange jumpsuits, and they're all walking down the street. Every one of them a giant in ISIS, and every one diminutive. It's staged, ladies and gentlemen. Now, does that mean they weren't killed? Yes, the journalists were killed. But I think the proof is, it means that U.S. and British intelligence went and rescued these people and told them, before you go back to the U.S. or France or wherever. Remember, they picked someone from every country so that every country would feel threatened by ISIS. And they said, before you go back, we want you to help us make an anti-ISIS video, or a video to make ISIS look bad. We're going to pretend to kill you. And this will really help us destroy ISIS. That's why you have this one British accent guy with a hooded mask, Yeehaw John, doing all the... And you don't behead people with a knife. All of the previous beheadings from terrorists have been with a great big Arab sword. That's how you behead someone. This is a butchering job. In fact, they finally got the picture. They must be reading my World Affairs Brief, because the latest video, they actually do a seesaw video, and you do see blood coming out. This poor Chechen, and what's really strange, though, is the new Yihajan is speaking Russian. I mean, nobody's asking any questions. Where does the ISIS people learn to speak Russian fluently? I mean, this is a setup, ladies and gentlemen. The Russians said, we don't know who this guy is. They took some Russian, captured him some way, and they did butcher him, but they actually showed the cutting for the first time. Well, I could tell you more, but let me tell you some of the other best proof that ISIS is a U.S. creation, and that is from a military standpoint. I'm a former military fighter attack pilot, and I'll tell you, our Navy pilots up there are really fed up with the U.S. government in the war on ISIS. They have said, and I've read their reports, that whenever we try to get permission to hit tanks or major concentration of troops, it takes almost an hour to get permission from Central Command, and they're up there flying in their airplane, and they have what's called bingo fuel. Bingo fuel means you get to a certain level and you've got to go back to base or you're going to run out before you get there. So when you're bingo fuel, you've got to go. And he said almost every time that permission comes just about the time we're bingo fuel, and we have to turn around and can't do the mission. I compiled a list in today's World Affairs Brief of the targets that the U.S. just said we did. They got a bulldozer. They got one ISIS soldier out in the open, and they bragged about this in their central, they gave a briefing on what they have. And they got some underground defensive position without telling what that was. It probably could have been a trench line or something. They put a bomb on it. I mean, that really is going to stop ISIS, isn't it? That's the kind of thing that we're dealing with, is that we, and the pilots aren't responsible for this. They're given a particular target. Now, of course, after the Paris attacks, which also have a lot of implications of false flag or phony government operations, which I'll get to in a minute. But of course, France said, we're going to join the war on terror now. They also got their version of the Patriot Act without even passing a law. They basically can arrest anybody without a warrant, unconditional surveillance of everybody. It was just issued by decree because of the Paris attacks. That was their 9/11. And part of the reasons for doing that, 9/11 gave the U.S. the excuse to go rampaging through the world. The Paris attacks, Charlie Hebdo didn't do it, so the big Paris attack later did, and suddenly all of Europe lays down and says, do whatever it takes. So the French Air Force goes in and attacks ISIS the next day. Well, how do you get on target and devise what your targets are and go into combat within a day? You don't. This takes months of planning to decide where the targets are. And then you find out, oh yeah, the U.S. gave us all the targets and we went in upon U.S. direction. So you're going to get a bulldozer and you're going to get a defensive position and a lone ISIS soldier here and there. And then we find out that the U.S. has been warning ISIS in advance of their attacks. When the Russians of the G20 mission, Putin comes out with satellite photos saying, look at this. Today at the Turkish border, here were 200 trucks lined up the Turkish border, oil tankers ready to go across the border. And here's the satellite photo showing them going across the border. Why isn't the U.S. taking those tankers out? That's the big income stream. And so the next day, the U.S. attacks a group of tanker trucks. But before they did so, they dropped a leaflet that says, we are going to attack in 45 minutes. We suggest that you leave your trucks so that you don't get killed. Because we're concerned about civilian casualties. Did they throw any of those leaflets down before drone strikes in Afghanistan, in Abbottabad, and other places of land? No, sir. What a phony excuse that we're concerned about. They were saving ISIS to make sure that nobody got killed. And that's the last time the U.S. bombed any oil trucks. Russians embarrass them, we go bomb because we're embarrassed, and then we don't do it again because we're concerned about civilian casualties. I mean, this war is a joke, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why under a year and a half of U.S. attacks on ISIS, ISIS just kept growing. Here's other evidence. As ISIS was moving into Iraq for this major attack, the Iraqis saw it coming. They were on the telephone with the White House saying, look, there's weapons depots out here, there's tank formations, we need air power to come in and hit them. Barack Obama and the National Security Council said, no, we're not going to get involved again in Iraq. So who was responsible for ISIS taking half of Iraq? The U.S. was. They could have stopped it. When they took Mosul, And remember, of course, they blame it on the Iraqi troops, who the U.S. trained at great military expense. The Iraqi troops fled for their lives, leaving behind all the American equipment. Well, ISIS had a big parade down the main highway coming out of Mosul with all these tanks and Humvees and Toyota Hilux pickups, which they got from the United States, by the way. And the U.S. has satellite reconnaissance constantly going on. You know, they have jets who were supposed to be giving direct air support. Do you think our Navy fighter pilots were ever tasked to hit that column of troops that could have got ISIS in one full thing? Not a single attack. Nothing. The Iraqi parliament also produced videos from their own soldiers of U.S. helicopters resupplying ISIS on the other side of the front. And then there's a video of the 75 or so Toyota Hilux pickup trucks coming down the highway with an Apache helicopter shadowing them below, not attacking them. What does that tell you? That's all very, very powerful evidence that the United States is protecting ISIS while pretending to attack ISIS. And that's why, and this is one of the other setbacks, probably the biggest of the list that I gave you, setbacks of globalism, the Russians, and I don't know why it took them so long, decided, hey, we can play this game too. We know the U.S. is faking their war on ISIS, so we're going to use the excuse of attacking terror, and we're going to go in there and save Assad. And that's exactly what they did. 2 months ago, Russia intervened, 30-some-odd fighters, and now they're up to 60 with a second base. And they have really turned the war around against the American-backed rebels. Aleppo is now under siege. Aleppo is the biggest city, or was the biggest city in Syria, and was completely decimated by ISIS. And now they're taking it back. And they're having a tough battle because without Russian troops on the ground, they've got Hezbollah troops, they've got Iranian troops, and they've got the Syrian army, battle-hardened Syrian army. But the U.S. has given thousands of TOW missiles to the Syrian rebels. And these are wire-guided missiles, ladies and gentlemen, and these are extremely accurate. I mean, you sit there and launch a TOW missile at a tank, you have an optical viewfinder, you just guide it to the tank. There's just no misses. They used a TOW missile to shoot down, and this is a war crime, to shoot down the Russian helicopter and went in to rescue the pilot of the Su-24 that was shot down by Turkey.